Okay. Hello everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon for this session, which Social Enterprise Scotland is holding in partnership with the TSI network and TSEF, or Third Sector Employability Forum, to give it its Sunday name. It's lovely to see so many of you here, and I have absolutely no doubt this is going to be a really interesting, fascinating session. I'm Jane. I'm the membership manager here at Social Enterprise Scotland, and I also sit on the exec group of TSEF. For folk that are not familiar with Social Enterprise Scotland, we're the national intermediary and membership organisation for social enterprises in Scotland. And very simply, our role is to kind of champion all things social enterprise. So that's support, promote, connect, and represent the sector. As part of that, we run regular sessions like this that we hope are going to be of interest to the social enterprise sector and beyond. So they're usually pretty informal, but given the number of folk here, I would ask if you could keep yourself on mute unless you want to ask a question. And when we come to that part, we'll just ask for virtual hands at that stage. That's it from me. It's short and sweet. I am going to hand over to Pegs now. Pegs is the National Third Sector Employability Partnership Engagement Manager, and I have to read that because there's no way on earth I'm remembering it. So Pegs is going to take us through the session today. Pegs, over to you.
Hi everybody and welcome, and apologies, I'm looking at the wrong camera because I've had to swap my screens around in order to be able to share the PowerPoint, and I also have been having some issues with my my internet, so I will probably switch my camera off as soon as I hand over to the speakers. So for those, yes, I won't have to say my job title again, but I guess those of you that have met me and those that haven't, I'm working along with Improvement Service, Scottish Government, third sector colleagues, third sector interfaces, and basically everybody and anybody who's interested, and local authorities, anybody and everybody who's interested in helping make the employability ecosystem work better in Scotland and in our local areas. And I'm really delighted to have so many people interested in this session today. I often wax on about how employability has traditionally been treated as a kind of complicated problem, that we just need to input, interview skills X and CV Y and maybe a bit of work experience Z, and out of the end will come an employable person. But that actually, in reality, once we look at people's journeys to work, it is a much more complex experience involving not just the issues that might be affecting individuals, such as yes, those things, but also confidence, self-esteem, healthcare challenges, but also external things like childcare, public transport, stigma in the workplace, and the availability of labour market opportunities which are relevant to them. So I'm really kind of excited to continue the conversation about, I think we're moving in this direction through No One Left Behind in Scotland, but to continue the conversation about how we move towards an approach to thinking about commissioning and planning employability services, which treats them as kind of more complex, emergent things than just than kind of this complicated thing. So I think that's kind of a bit about my background and my interest in this. I worked with Andy through work we did on, through human learning systems. I think that's how we first got in touch with each other, which is another thematic workshop, I think. But really resonated with some of the things that he was talking about around commissioning and complexity, and in the end, with Adam and others in Fife, ended up working really closely with him to help move things forward in terms of the strategic end of that complexity-oriented focus in Fife. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Andy. He's going to talk a bit about this thing called commissioning and complexity, maybe why we want to start thinking about how that might look a bit different to what maybe the more traditional approach is. And I'm not saying that, we're all doing that, but, there might be a lot of that going on. And then Adam Dunkerley is here from the Opportunities Fife Partnership to talk about kind of what that ended up looking like in Fife in terms of how we move forward with our commissioning, but also then how that then started informing some of the strategic conversations and planning and so on. So that's enough from me. We are going to take, there's a lot of us on the call, so we will take questions at the end. But if anything pops up for you while people are talking and you want to make sure it gets captured, if you pop it in the chat, I'll be keeping an eye on the chat. And hopefully there'll be plenty of time for that at the end for everybody to really kind of get into the nuts and bolts of what this all is. So I think that is it from me. I am going to stop my video. I am going to share my screen. I'm going to hope this works, and I'm going to hand over to Andy.
Thank you, Pegs. Good afternoon, all. Great to be with you. So, as Pegs has said, my name's Andy Brogan from Easier Inc. We're a small management consultancy that specialise in helping people to sort of improve their work through relational ways of working. Some of that will come into what I talked to you about today. The overall theme, as you know, is commissioning and complexity. And the intention is I'm going to do a bit of scene setting in terms of the sort of theoretical underpinnings of this before Adam takes you through the sort of real world experience of what it's like to do it in practice. And then I hope we're going to have a good chat at the end. So Pegs, if you want to take us on to the next slide. So my background, folks, is in healthcare and public services. Worked in a number of different places, but most substantially down in Torbay, where I sat on both sides of the commissioning relationship at different times. So at one point I was a commissioner, at another point running services. And I think one of the things that struck me at the time was in both of those roles, it really mattered to me and everyone around me that we were working on the right stuff. And as I've gone around, Scotland, England, Wales, meeting lots of commissioners and providers, that's what I see time and time again. There's plenty of vocation, loads of good intent. And wherever you are in the commissioning relationship, you want to know that you're working on the right things. So as commissioners, one of the needs we've got, I think, is not just to be working with good providers, but to have the assurance that the things we're working on are the things that really matter, that we're managing those things well, and that ultimately what really matters is what's getting done. But how we go about that has some really quite significant implications, which we're going to touch on now. Pegs, next slide. So back in the days when I was a commissioner, the kind of mantra was deliverology. It was all the stuff from Tony Blair's government, and we're being really pushed hard to make sure that providers were delivering. And at that time, I would say I got 90% of what I did wrong. So this is a story of my learning to some extent. I was pushing providers for delivery. I was writing contracts which were trying to be super particular around what are we going to get for our money and how are we going to hold you to account for that and have assurance that you did what you said you were going to do. But a key bit of learning for me was that what really matters often doesn't look like delivery. It looks like impact, and those two things are not the same. So next slide. So just give you a moment to read this, but this is an example of how delivery and impact can be quite different. So in case you have a very small screen and can't make it out, there is a ridiculous picture of a couple of guys in a bobcat trying to clear a path covered in sand next to a beach in a gale force wind. And you might think, what on earth are they doing? Are they idiots? And the reality is, no, they're not. I actually knew these guys, believe it or not. But they were under contract to clear the path at the same point in each month, regardless of the conditions at that point in the month. And so me in my old world of managing for delivery would have been sat at arm's length in a nice ivory tower somewhere, looking at the numbers saying, did the guys clear the path on that week of the month? Not did the path stay clear, not was that a useful thing to do. So you can see that there might be, as there was for me in my commissioning role, plenty of good intent, plenty of sort of smart thinking and all the rest of it. But good intentions were leading to ridiculous consequences like the one that you see on screen just now. So if we want to commission and lead for impact, what do we need to do differently? Pegs, do you want to take us to the next slide? Well, the first misstep that I took was I thought, well, we just need to get better at measuring the right things. So don't measure what week of the month they cleared the path, measure whether the path is clear. And that sounds really simple. And in the parlance of the time, that was all about moving to outcomes-based commissioning. But what I started to realize was that outcomes are actually always multifactorial. So they're not reducible to a single measurable thing, is my point. And so as we try and measure outcomes, what I learned is you can't ever actually measure the whole of the outcome. You can only measure elements of what matters. And you can measure lots of elements, but you can never escape the need to actually bring some judgment to what are these data telling us. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. One that can be quite emotive for people, but this is again personal to me, that when I've worked in the NHS, cancer survival rates are considered a really important measure, and they're often considered an outcome measure. However, we also know that survival isn't the only thing that matters to people when they've had a diagnosis. It may be the first thing that occurs to them. It may be the thing that they really, really want to be achievable. But of course, in some cases, you may not have that long left anyway, even if we give you all the treatment. And it's quality of remaining life that matters rather than length of life or survival. So the point about that example is that even something as seemingly obvious as wanting to stay alive in the face of illness, even that isn't a simple measurable outcome. That there are lots of elements that need to come together in order for us to understand whether we've done what matters. So I talk about that now as seeing performance in the round. And what I mean by that is how different elements of what matters come together in the round and around a purpose, an intent that is of value. So we can think about that at the level of individuals, like in the case of, surviving cancer, or we can think of that in the case of kind of bigger systems, complex issues like employability and all the things that might matter as we look at a population. So the key thing here is, if the shift from managing for deliverology towards managing for impact requires us to change what we measure, I think it's not just changing what we measure, but it's changing the role that we give measures. So we can never escape the need for some sense making which goes beyond the individual points of data in order to understand what do they mean in the round. And the mistake I made when I first started to try and go this route was I didn't think that way. I thought, well, we can have better measures, we'll measure them, and we'll keep people accountable for better measures. And here's what happened. So if you want to click the next slide. So I took that lovely idea of performance in the round. I said, well, we've got better measures, so I'm now going to hold you to account for different measures. And before you know it, I'd squeezed the balloon, I'd distorted practice, and what I saw was we just had a new, different set of dysfunctions with people chasing problems around their system. Okay, so the key thing here is if we want to manage for impact, and that looks like managing the things that really matter, we need to recognize that the role we give measures isn't scorekeeping, it's sense making. And therefore, we can't simply hold providers accountable for individual measures or even groups of measures if what we're doing is saying that certain targets are what they need to achieve. What we really need to do is work with providers to help them have the data they need in order to sense into what's happening in their system, in order to make good, well-intended decisions about whether they're delivering what matters. So if you go on to the next slide for me. So I think if I was to summarize all my learning over those years, it's pretty much reducible to this, which is in my old way of working, I would have had measures, I would have set targets, I would have treated those targets as scores to be kept, and I would have seen my role as essentially evaluating the performance of the providers and holding them to account for whether they're doing the right things. And I think what I've learned is a much healthier, more productive and more impactful way of working has been to move from targets to measures, to move from keeping score to helping people make sense. So now my relationship with providers looks like being part of the sense-making process, working hand in glove with them, being less at a distance and much more kind of involved and integrated with them. Where what I'm trying to do is provide some element of leadership by keeping purpose at the centre, but also trying to create some sense of fellowship, me with them, but also providers with each other, with other providers and with citizens, so that they're making sense of what's happening together. And my job as commissioner then becomes much more about how am I stewarding an environment that is healthy and learning led and focused on purpose, but is putting measures in service to what are we learning about how to achieve that purpose. So much more fluid and adaptive, much more relational, much less me playing that role of lawmaker, judge and jury that I used to play. So that's the sort of theory. Adam is going to take you through what that has been like for him and his colleagues at Opportunities Fife.
Thanks, Andy. I'm going to apologise first and foremost because I'm going to kind of talk around about my slides a bit because they probably don't reflect as well as they should do the content that I'm going to deliver. I started this from the point of view of we've just been working with Andy essentially on a strategy refresh that we launched, or we passed in June this year, and we'll kind of be launching at our Know Your Network event in November. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but actually the strategy is kind of the next part of a journey that we've been on probably for about 10 years. So I'll try and factor some of that into what's been happening. But essentially, building on the work that Andy's just picked up, we've been on this journey about moving away from the numbers kind of pushing the agenda. And it's been a difficult one. And it kind of started with our European programme, first and foremost. And if we go back to the previous European programme that a lot of you will have been involved in, we were commissioning activity in order to sort of reflect the need in Fife, essentially. And just before the European programme was implemented, there was a review of activity around about Opportunities Fife and our local employer partnership. And essentially, that independent review came up with a few key recommendations. They were things like we were a true partnership, but we were focused on sort of people further that were closer to the job market. It made a critique of our progression or our employment rates, essentially, for the number of people we were supporting into work. There was comments that we have a rich and vibrant third sector, but they weren't being utilised as effectively as they could be. There was a lot of discussion about the fact that third sector were duplicating each other's work, but in different areas, that they were competing for clients, that they were small projects that were almost getting in each other's way. There was also a comment that the partnership, essentially, or the council, was making policy for its own purposes in terms of delivery. So there was some quite scathing critiques, as much as things to build on. And my post is one of the things that came out of that review, to sort of separate employability policy from employability delivery from the council point of view, and try and support our third sector capacity building. Now, some of you that know Pegs will know that she worked in Fife for many years before she's taken on this role. And again, part of Pegs' work was working with me to try and establish how did we support third sector partners to deliver some of the work that we needed to do. And a huge amount of that work went into training and governance and, supporting organisations to be practically able to deliver, as well as having a commissioning framework and an intention that we would support third sector partners to deliver aspects of our European programme and then employability programmes from then on in. Now, we're really proud of the work that we've done in Fife around about that. However, we're still on a journey and we've not necessarily got this completely right yet. Although I think we're moving in a direction. Hopefully the strategy bits that I come on to will show that. Can you click on to the next slide, please, Pegs? Thanks. So essentially, just to say, this is our Opportunities Fife Partnership. As our LEP, we've got strategic decision-making powers, and we've got responsibility for delivering aspects of the plan for Fife. So it's the inclusive jobs and growth ambition. And those are the people that kind of sit around the table on Ops Fife. And essentially, what we're trying to do is set the preconditions for the best possible services that we can put on the ground in terms of employability. Now, I like to think that our European programme was a success. We helped, I'm not going to go into the numbers, and I've not got slides for the numbers, but we helped, close to 3,000 people a year. We got, 40% of people were moving into employment. It was really positive, and that was significantly better than what we've done in the previous programme, which is great. But as a governance group, we were looking at that, how many people are registered, how many people are going to work. Now, we did have a look at, and we did discuss, and we did talk about, soft progressions. We talked about the type of activity that people were delivering. Also, our European programme moved significantly away from those closer to the job market to those with multiple barriers, those further from the job markets. We were focusing on practical things like people with mental health difficulties. We had physical health difficulties. We talked about parents that were lone parents, workless families. We were looking at young people who were in danger of leaving school to negative destinations, or who had left school to a positive destination but failed to sustain it. There was some really significant key groups that we were focusing on. And it's very, very difficult for you to put a project on the ground that you can say, this project for young people and this project for inactive or multi-barrier adults can be compared in the same way. But yet we were. And again, it kind of talks about some of the stuff that Andy was mentioning. And we were, because we're saying, how many people are they working with? How many people are going into work? Are they sustaining that work? And not really taking into account the nuances of the work that needed to be done and the complexities of that work. As much as behind the scenes, we discussed it a lot. In Peg's previous role, she championed that work, particularly through some of the third sector providers. The nature of the work was always at the forefront. We talked about good news stories. We talked about, we have videos produced to talk about the type of work that we were delivering. And there was a lot of discussion about, this is great work, it's doing really well. But at the end of the day, when we reported back to the Fife Partnership, when we reported back to elected members, when we report back into committee, it always came back to, how many people did we help? How much money did we spend? Was it value for money? And again, that conversation comes up of, if you didn't get a job, is it value for money? And I understand from an employability point of view, we really want to put people into employment. We want to put them to sustainable employment, healthy employment that's going to result in career progression. And these are good things. But a job in the old way didn't necessarily chart all that. It could have been any job. So not necessarily was it combating poverty or helping people to progress. Whereas a project that was doing all these things, but perhaps hadn't got that person into work, wasn't getting the same sort of credit as a project that had multiple jobs. And we had this discussion all the way through the European programme. And we talked about, how did we change that for the better going forward? And essentially, there was a lot of work that went on around about service design between the end of the European programmes, people remember it, and the start of No One Left Behind. And this kind of brings us up to where we are. So we have a range of commissioning frameworks. Peg is going to move me on because I'm obviously taking too much time. But we've had a range of commissioning frameworks, essentially, that focus on No One Left Behind, that have then focused on the tackling poverty element, that have then focused on UK Shared Prosperity Fund activity coming in. And what we've tried to do is, particularly in the last 4 years now, since 2020, is think about service design and think about principles. And I'll come to that in the next slide. But essentially, we're looking at, or we're trying to look at, quality of service that's being delivered being as considered as important as the content, so that activity is co-designed to ensure that the client experience is basically at the heart of everything we do. Now, the work that we've done over the last maybe sort of, well, it kind of started off maybe last October, so the last year, where we've done workshops with the partnership, with the different stakeholders, with service users. We've tried to create a new mission statement, new priorities for the Ops Fife partnership that you can see on the screen. And essentially, what we're trying to do is shape and drive responsive, sustainable approaches to skills and employability that reflect current and future aspirations of individuals and employers. That's our mission. Our priorities are about inclusive jobs and growth, about tackling poverty and inequalities, that client experience, which is key. And then we've got strategic targeting and effective governance. Now, you need that governance to make sure that we're delivering the right services, we're compliant, that management is in place, so you are delivering things and people are held to account. Or you don't get the inclusive jobs, you don't get to tackle poverty. But one of the things that we're looking at is making sure our services are understanding of they're data led, but they're understanding of the local needs in Fife as well. And what we're going to try and do is we're trying to create that strategic targeting. Now, it's interesting just now because obviously we're in a bit of limbo waiting for an autumn statement, understanding what might come next in terms of UK SPF or a replacement fund, understanding where Scottish Government might be for No One Left Behind in tackling poverty. But essentially, we will be producing a new commissioning framework at some point in the next sort of 12 months to look at recommissioning new projects and what they might look like. What we will do is we will take, the Scottish Government's employability plan and look at the key demographics. But one of the things that we've had a lot of success with is trying to understand how we put an infrastructure around about some of the commissioning aspects. And essentially, what we want to do is make sure that our third sector organisations, as much as the council's organisations, essentially have enough expertise to bid for work, to understand where they want to bid for work and effectively deliver that work. So we will essentially look at how we fit those key demographics with the people of Fife. We'll do a breakdown with our partners at the Equality Centre to look at where there is most need, whether that's geographical need, whether that's client demographic, essentially, in terms of types of support they'll need. And we'll frame that up in a commissioning framework and we'll ask for open and transparent bidding, essentially. What we've done over the last few years is we've had a scoring team that's looked at bids, but we've added the voice of lived experience to that panel as well. And again, that's changed the way that we commission activity, because very much in those conversations around about what's scored highly, where the preferred bidders are and things like that, the people who have been involved in delivering and receiving employability services sometimes want those services to look very different to the way that the delivery partners sometimes want to deliver them. So essentially taking that into account when we've commissioned activity has really changed what our pathway looks like just now. Pegs, do you want to go on to the next one? So this is a big part of our new commissioning strategy and has been for the last couple of years. And this is about principles of service delivery. Again, these were co-designed and with the voice of lived experience, and essentially our lived experience team have been involved in establishing this. Now, these were originally done for No One Left Behind, actually have been sort of incorporated into everything we do for UK SPF, and will continue with everything we do for Opportunities Fife for the foreseeable future. Essentially, what we're trying to do is create a suite of programs that follow these principles so that people, no matter where they engage along the pathway, whether it's a third sector provision, whether it's partnership and collaborate, whether it's Fife Council, that all of the clients receive a service that feels similar, that is equal and fair, that's strength-based, that's non-judgmental, etc. Now, the way we do that is we've invested in a range of training so that no matter where you enter the Opportunities Fife pathway, all of the people that you would engage with would have had things like good conversations training. There'll be equalities informed. There'll be trauma informed. We're investing in training now to support people who have got convictions, so that there's an understanding of how to ask difficult questions, not just around retrieving data in order to register clients, but in order to assess the client needs in order to establish a tailored program. But also how to respond to when you get difficult answers back from those difficult questions. And I think that's really important, that, you know, if we're asking frontline staff to ask difficult questions and to get information and to create sort of training plans and employability journeys, that they are comfortable doing that, and they've got the training behind them to understand what that looks like. If you skip on to the next one, Pigs. Right, I'm going to skip through these quite quickly, but essentially, this is the new governance framework for Opportunities Fife, and essentially we changed the governance structure to reflect the new kind of strategy. The only one I'm going to talk about is the oversight group, which we had to change the name because it was the delivery and oversight group, but we kept on referring to it as DOG, and it's probably not the best acronym for an oversight group. But essentially, we created that to monitor the performance of the pathway, and I'll come to the measures in a second. What we're doing is we are looking at, obviously, our projects delivering what we need them to deliver in terms of, you know, positive outcomes and progressions and things, as always, because we have to have those checks. But we're also looking at the quality of delivery. We invite delivery partners in to speak to the board to talk about not just the type of delivery that they're delivering, but where the challenges lie. So can the board help them? Are there other partners that they don't know about that they might want to be linked into? And also it creates that human aspect, that oversight group knows the people that are delivering the service and they understand the quality and the time and the effort that goes into it. And we've put a lot of effort into that delivery and oversight group over the last 12 months to make sure that the performance of the pathway is monitored from statistical point of view with the quantitative data, but also the qualitative stuff comes out as well. You skip on to the next one, Pigs. There we go. So one of the things that Andy talked about with us was about how we measure progress and impact. And what we decided is we're going to look at 3 things and break those down. So we look at vital signs, and we're essentially trying to look at taking the pulse of where we work. So it's things that we understand will impact the way the partnership works. We then want to look at things like planning measures, so where we can make targeted interventions, where the vital signs point us in the direction. What do we want to do in order to identify where there's inequalities or where we need to direct support? And then balancing measures, which is essentially, are we doing things right? If you skip on to the next one, please, Pigs. These are our vital signs, essentially. So some of these are national figures. We're looking at participation measure. We're looking at the percentage rate of unemployment, the percentage and rate of economic inactivity. But we're also looking at the number of people that are in support in the pathway. And at the top there, we were always looking at how do we link together with our tackling poverty agenda. So we're starting to pick up on the percentage of young people living in a low-income household as well. But the other aspect that we hadn't had previously that fits into that sort of pyramid is how the people that are using the service rate that support. So this is something that, as I said, we've just passed in June and we're working on just now. When we launch this in November with the full partnership and move into next year, we're going to be using this possibly as some sort of like online review system. I'm terrible at this, but I kind of liken it to when you go into booking.com and you go somewhere and then they send you an email 2 days later and they say, how was your stay? And you go, oh, it was 4. And then they go, oh, but why was it 4? Was it really clean? Was it this? Was it that? And they ask you 5 extra questions. And it turns out it was 4.6, not 4. But that's the sort of thing. We'd like to ask people a few key questions that they can answer very quickly that gives us an understanding of how do they rate the service. And that's what we'll be looking at. If you skip on to the next one, Pigs. Thank you. For the planning measures, essentially, we're going to look at that pyramid, essentially. But what we're going to do is we're using support that we get from our colleagues through the Centre for Equalities. We're going to try and cut that data via place and location within Fife, not just at a community level, but sometimes right down to, a committee level, down to individual communities. We're going to look at gender, ethnicity, age, disability, those sorts of things, so that when we do create commissioning frameworks, we can be quite prescriptive that says we need services in this part of Fife or this part of Fife that can do these things. And that gives our partners, when they bid in for activity, a real focus on how can they make a difference in those communities. Can you skip on to the next one, Pegs? This is the last one on measures, and essentially we're just to highlight the sort of things that we have to factor in. So just to make sure that the partnership doesn't fall apart. So again, these are considered by our board on an escalation by exception basis. So it's things like the budget, is there a problem? Is our financial profile working? And again, because we commission out in the way we do, everything's on a quarterly and arrears basis. So the budget, once it's decided, isn't much of a worry because activity should be delivered in a certain way. The only issue we may have is through lack of performance or lack of satisfactory performance, do we have to review that? And again, touch wood, and I'm thankful that we've not had to do that in recent years. Our partners have been performing incredibly well, but it's one of those things that we do check out. Again, national reporting requirements. Do we satisfy Scottish Government? What are the key risks? There's the big things about the client experience. If we start to see the client experience drastically reduced in certain providers, but really highly regarded in others, we would have to look at that. And again, project performance would be the other things. And I'll skip to the last slide, Pigs. We put something together as well to try and look at where were we before this service design and where are we now. And I won't go through all of them, but essentially what we're trying to say is beforehand, we delivered services or we commissioned services based on what the delivery partners could do. But now we're encouraging them to embed reflective practice, think about frontline staff, think about what's required and tweak what they do to meet needs, essentially. Staff training came from the provider. Now we're trying to put staff training that's strength-based, that again is relevant across the pathway to whatever situations they might be put in based on the clients that they're working with. And we try and keep that blanket across so everybody gets the same experience. When we're commissioning, again, it used to be professional partners with a focus on targets. Now we're looking at how did the lived experience panel get involved? How do we assess applications for the type of activity they want to be involved in? We used to be based very heavily on numbers, and I do apologise for that in a way that was what we were driven towards. But we now really understand that the numbers are assessed and they're relevant, but you want to have those principles of service delivery to prop it up. As a service that churns out numbers that don't mean anything if it's not impacting the people's lives, is it not helping them combat poverty and live without the support of an employability provider, it's not worth having. Commissioning line with timeframes, this is a beaut. We would love to commission with multi-year fundings, but we can't, obviously, because of the nature of the money that we receive. But what we did this time is we commissioned a 1+1+1 program as opposed to a 3-year program, because we wanted to give clients longevity and commitment and some sort of continuity. But when the funding's only on a year-by-year basis, we were saying to the delivery partners, our intention is to keep you going for this period of time, but the budget may fluctuate based on what comes available. And again, we do that through a challenge fund process. We didn't procure any of this activity, which means we can have that kind of partnership engagement as opposed to we're buying X amount of services for X amount of money sort of thing. Governance and oversight, again, having the lived experience team involved in the oversight group has been key. It allows us to reflect on, is the client at the heart of the work that we do? We monitor performance, again, based on job outcomes, but are those the right job outcomes at the right time? And again, we would like to kind of work on a continuous improvement basis, or we do work on a continuous improvement basis now. So it's been a huge journey, and I'm delighted to say we get a huge amount of support from our third sector colleagues, from our council colleagues, both in delivery and in strategy. I've got a range of partners around the table that have really got behind this as a way forward, because I do understand that when we took off on this journey, it was quite a radical thing to do. We weren't ring fencing activity specifically for council delivery. We were asking colleagues to bid for activity. We were also putting a lot of faith in organisations that often delivered small contracts, but to scale up or to work in partnership in order to deliver larger contracts. But we've had a lot of success, both in terms of numbers, but in terms of client satisfaction, essentially, in getting this right. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody likes the approach. When there's times where funding is tight, we do get asked questions about why there's so much money going out of the council towards other organisations and things. But I think the approach and the statistics and the feedback speaks for itself in terms of this is the right way to help people out of poverty. This is the right way to help community organisations, build support networks. And I'm very proud of the work that we've been able to do to put that on the ground. So I am happy to answer any questions, but I do know that Andy's got other stuff to go through. But hopefully I've picked up on, the commissioning and complexity and how our strategies moved forward because of that.
Thanks, Adam. So I might just share a quick couple of summary thoughts and then we can open it up for discussion. But I think no matter how well we put this stuff across, one of the things I always find quite elusive is bringing to life how different it can feel in practice. Because it's not as if in my old way of doing commissioning, it's not as if a lot of these things were in my thinking or were things that I was trying to do. But I think some of it is not just about what we're trying to do, it's about what we're ready to give up as well. So the table on screen is an attempt to capture some of the shifts that this has required in practice. So not just doing new things, but giving up old things. So in that complex world that we're all working in, it's tempting because it feels like there's a security blanket and there's lots of certainty attached to have nice plans and contracts that speak to the years ahead and so on. But I think what I've seen is we need to increasingly give up on that and favour continuous adaptive planning over having fixed plans. And that obviously puts a premium on having good communication, good relationships, etc., with our providers and other partners. With measures, I know I majored on that in my introduction, but it's not just measuring the right things, it's orientating ourselves to the use of measures in a completely different way and being prepared to actually give up on the use of targets in favour of saying we do need good data and we need to pay attention to the data. But really the thing that's most important is that we've created the environment for thinking and learning together, where this data is helping us to have the right conversation rather than reducing us to a transactional have you hit the number yet conversation. That links into something I've really sort of felt and experienced around accountability, which is it's very easy to default into what I think of as a holding to account mode, where I as commissioner hold on to the power and I'm responsible for evaluating and judging you, the provider. And that not only tends to create lots of psychological unsafety, it tends to actually limit the transparency with which data and issues are shared, not just with me as commissioner, but also between provider networks. So it actually reduces the quantum of collaboration across provider networks if we're in a holding to account mode. So what I've experienced is it really matters that as a commissioner, I shift into what I think of now as helping to account, which is how am I bringing providers together to help them make sense of what's happening so that they're having a good, transparent, collaborative conversation and I'm not the one holding on to the power. Best practice is another area that's been painful to give up, but I've had to, because what we've seen is that there's always better practice out there, but what constitutes the right practice for each place can be radically different. Even for each individual citizen, it can be radically different. So instead of thinking about how do we get to best practice, what I've seen is it really matters that we're creating those sort of learning-led, adaptable environments where we're always thinking, how do we get to even better practice here, which might be different to there and there and there. And so when it comes down to the role that I've found myself playing in that commissioner mode, it's moving from being the person who determines what matters and determines how well we're achieving it into being the person who's creating the environment for thinking and collaboration. And finally, on this slide, what that's meant is that actually increasingly it's shifting away from a behaviour where people report up to me as commissioner and moving towards actually where I turn up rather than I'm reported up to. So really working hand in glove with providers as part of the provider network, providing that sort of stewardship that I mentioned earlier. So just one last slide from me and then we'll open up for discussion. Pegs, if you could move us on. So that's a lot to have thrown at you. And if I was trying to sum it up in a single slide, here's the best I've come up with so far. So really focusing on the relationships. Thinking about how am I sharing power or even giving power away. Not doing that in a way which means I just give power away, detach and no longer pay attention, but sharing that power and giving it away and then turning up and being really, really interested and disciplined in my interest around what's happening or not happening that should be happening and what are the tensions or obstacles to kind of having the impact we want that are getting in the way. Giving up targets, but not giving up measures. So good data in use all the time in service to learning, but that learning also being in service to purpose. So again, as Commissioner, having real clarity around, okay, what is the end game here that we're all aiming at? What's that purpose? So it's not cozy club. It's not, I've given my power away. I've said, don't worry about the numbers. And as long as you're learning, it's all cozy. It's not that. It's still got plenty of rigor attached. But what I'm trying to do is turn up in a way that is about sharing power, using data, creating learning, and keeping purpose right at the center of everything that we're doing and talking about. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and just open it up for discussion, questions to Adam, or anything you want to share, examples you've got, anything that this raises as an issue or an opportunity. I'm interested in what sense you're making of it, folks.
So I'm going to stop sharing, Andy, if that's okay, but hopefully people can check in with those questions and maybe bring that into the reflections or questions that you bring. Thank you both so much for your time. Oh, I'm going to move my screen now so I can actually look at you all. And your contributions both. I feel re-inspired, to be honest, despite having been involved in it quite a bit. So there's already a couple of questions in the chat, so I'll maybe go to those first, and then everybody else, just take your time. But if you pop your hands up, we'll just work through everybody in order. So David's popped in a question around the recompense for the lived experience work that gets done around, for example, getting involved in the applications. I mean, do you want me to answer that, Adam? Because I was kind of a bit involved in it. Or
I was going to throw that one your way because I was like, I'm pretty sure there was like subsistence and traveling expenses, but I didn't want to say that without you. But yeah, you facilitated that. So yes, please.
Our work evolved in that arena, David. So we started off with people getting involved as volunteers and or just as participants in collaborative activities. And then obviously, because we're a TSI, we're volunteering, we always pay expenses, subsistence costs, that kind of thing. Sometimes people preferred that in form of vouchers because of benefits issues, effectively. So we absolutely always did that. What then kind of we moved towards was actually we did have a paid role as the lived experience team rep, and they last time, I think, if I remember rightly, they were the person that kind of came onto. Actually, they weren't. Were they the person that came onto the commission? The application form. Anyway, that's kind of where it's moving towards. Is kind of actually having people in a paid role doing that with volunteers behind them and supporting. So there's kind of a progression of ways of getting involved rather than it kind of being either you're paid or you're not paid. But that's kind of, but obviously that was that's going to be for Dorothea to pick up, I think, with Adam in her role going forward. So yeah. So the next question was from Harriet. So Harriet, I don't know if you want to unmute and ask that question, or I could just read it out.
I'm happy to read. Well, there's two questions. One is you both, Adam and Andy, spoke about this. How at risk is this new strategy and new thinking from the culture of the way things have always been done? That's my first question, and really how you tracking that and keeping it on track. It's what I do in my work, is work with companies that have great ideas, but then their culture eats their strategy. So I was wondering how you were dealing with that. That's my first question. Maybe take one at a time.
I think that's the ongoing thing. So happily, the start of the process, everybody was on board with how do we change? So the process has been, this is the direction of travel. We want to do things differently. We wanted to make a step change, which is why we went in this direction. And it probably would have been more at risk if we'd fallen on our faces, which was a real possibility. But we had organisations that stood up and really have delivered. So that was good. So you actually started to see the traditional monitoring outputs going up based on the new way of working. So that was good. But what we've been trying to do over the last couple of years is, as personnel changes and as elected members changes and things like that, you're in a situation where you might consistently have to resell the value of what we're doing to new people, and then reprove again that this is the right direction of travel. And those are, I won't say arguments, but these are things that we're trying to continue to do consistently. Again, we've had continued success at what we're doing. If we were performing badly, it would be harder, but we're okay just now. And people that are coming in see it and they go, oh, it's really interesting, it's really different. That's great. So we're all right with that just now, but I'm not sure if it's, people like things that are going well.
Yeah, good points. And also that point about needing change and everybody accepting that they need change is a great way to start. My other question was perhaps an idiot's question, so forgive me. I was wondering how much of the data and the learning that you're doing is being shared across the education sector. I coach head teachers across councils in Scotland and know that they're dealing with massive deprivation and worries about employability on stream. So I just wondered how much interface there was with that sector.
There's I'll say significant, but it's hard to kind of quantify like that. But we have a head of education sits on the Opportunities Fife Partnership board, but also we have a rep from our developing young workforce team as well. And there has been overlap with more people from DYW that sit on Opportunities Fife just because of their positions in the organisations, like NHS, like the college. There's an overlap. So there's a continued sort of feedback loop, if you like, between how do we support young people who are coming out of school, how do we support schools to understand the issues around about things. Again, I see one of my colleagues, Zoe, on the call, who works with one of our services that supports disadvantaged families. Fife Gingerbread have been very, very involved in some of the work around about the schools in their specific areas that they work in. So there's probably at a strategic level a good link up. At a management level, there's a link up, and at a delivery level, there is delivery partners that will be engaged very specifically in certain schools. But I wouldn't necessarily say that's consistent across all the schools because it'll depend on what activity is in the area.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
I wondered, there's a couple more questions, but Andy, did you want to add anything about the risk of the strategy, being eaten by the culture? Have you had anything you'd want to add to that before we move on?
So I was just typing something in case I didn't get a chance to say, but really briefly to comment on it. I think your question's on the money. I would say this work is at least as much about culture as it is about strategy or anything else. And that because the strategy, in a sense, is to create an environment where learning is in service to purpose, that enacting that strategy changes the culture. But of course it's
it's okay.
Like everything, it's not easy, because if it was easy, we'd all, have done it a million years ago. But I think even just holding that intent close and clear in mind, that what we want is learning in service to purpose, and that this is a cultural intervention. I think being clear about that is actually pretty helpful and gets you a long way in itself.
I was going to just add one other thing, because I know Adam's talked about it in other conversations we've had, but the culture is made up of people, and when you lose key people, or if you lose a chunk of key people all at once, that can create a lot of risk to the journey as well. So there's that's also part of the challenge, isn't it? So where if you get stability, well, sometimes stability can stop change, but if you've got stability of people who are embracing change, then that's great. But when one or two or three of those people might move on, then there's a lot of work to kind of pick things up again. So I think that's important. I've seen there's one that's for me, but I'm going to go to the other one first, which is around how can we encourage commissioners across the country to take this on board? And that's from Michelle, and she says her mic isn't working. So we're not going to ask you to speak to that. But I think, well, this is part of this. So there are individuals here who are involved in commissioning across Scotland around employability. So hopefully some people here might feel inspired or reassured that they're doing all of this already, or they might feel inspired to take some ideas forward that feel relevant to them. But yeah, so I don't know if others have thoughts, and Andy or Adam, around that, spreading the message, I suppose, really, isn't it?
I mean, it's I'll come with this with a city region hat on, because that's the other work that I do is about Edinburgh and South East Scotland city region deal. And we, as 6 local authorities, we do things in a slightly different way. So therefore, it should be what's right for the people that you're supporting. And again, so there's a good example of a project. Again, Fife Gingerbread are involved. I think Stacey Cuthbertson's on the call from the Capital City Partnership. Now, basically, this is an intensive family support service that works across 6 local authorities, but it looks slightly different in each of the local authority areas based on those local authorities or the LEPs deciding at what juncture the support comes in, the types of families that need supported. But the regional aspect of it is about a community of practice. So it's one of these things where if you can get commissioning right, that meets the needs. So again, understanding the type of people that you need to support, where they are, who would be best to deliver that support. Because again, we realised that we needed third sector to really step up and deliver in the community for us. That gives you the conditions to say, well, can we do that in the current framework? And if you can't do that in the current framework, how do you change it? And one of the big things for us has been about co-design and co-production, and not deciding in a room because we've always done this, wouldn't it be great if we tried that, and it not working. It's that idea of what do people want to see on the ground? Does it work? And if there's resistance from, I don't know, senior management or elected members or whoever it might be, having the backup that says, no, the people on the ground that will be engaging in the service, the feedback is this is what they want to see, is quite a strong voice to try and, I suppose, sell the concept of commissioning in that way.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Adam. Andy, were you going to come in?
Yeah, tuppence worth for me. So I think there are 3 elements here. So the first one is, along the lines of the success sells stuff. Yeah. So people need to see that this works. Otherwise, why would they ever be interested? I think that's fair enough. The problem is if we only stay there and all we do is sell this sort of stories of hope or success, I think what happens is that this stuff gets assimilated into pre-existing ways of working and the value gets lost. So I think alongside the stories of hope, awkward as it may be, I think we also need to sell the stories of discontent or horror or whatever we want to describe them as. Where is the current approach failing us or falling short? And then the third element for me is that when we tell those stories, I think it's either very easy to water them down because we don't want to upset people, or end up upsetting people because it's a bit like telling them they've got ugly kids. No one wants to hear it. So I think the third element then is how do we make the kind of communications element of this, whether it's telling the stories of hope or giving the bad news, a bridge into some action learning type experiences. Because I think where I've found this gets traction is when people go to their system or their service and have a look and join the dots between how are our current approaches here limiting our current impact here. So I think for me, the biggest challenge is not a communications challenge. It's how we get people into that action step so they can learn it in practice. That's the tough bit.
That's really interesting. And that's actually going to maybe segue nicely because I see Andy's got his hand up, but Andy and I were both at a rural employability partnership learning exchange a couple of weeks ago, hosted by Elsa, who is somewhere on this call from Inspire Alba, looking at third sector employability partnerships, and it was very dialogue based, and it was very action learning based, I felt, and it felt like creating those safe spaces to kind of talk about what's going well, so stories of hope, but then what can be translated from that into the realities in different areas, the very different strategic delivery demographic challenges, which or even individual challenges which are in each area, is really, really helpful. So that was interesting as a segue. But Andy, I'm going to move to Andy, and then I'm aware there are more questions coming through in the chat. So, but he's been brave enough to put his hand up.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Yes. You can hear me, yes. Thanks. This is for Adam, if you're still on the call. You're there, Adam. Yeah. Just when I kind of get to fully clarifying in my mind when we can procure and when we can grant fund, because there's a real mixed picture across Scotland. Some authorities grant fund, some procure. Adam, you've slightly confused me a wee bit in that I think you said you run a grant fund, a challenge fund in Fife, yet I noticed your wording, and when you were speaking, you used the word commissioning, you used the word contracts, and our procurement service in Highland that we share with Aberdeenshire and Aberdeen, they would very much, I think, view this clearly as a procurement, and even, dare I say, your language suggests it's a procurement. And so I'm always very curious how, say in Fife, or I know John in Dundee, you can say to your procurement service that this isn't a procurement, this is a grant fund, because I would love to do a grant fund in Highland for various reasons, but we're very much driven by that it's procurement. And I'm just to say conscious of some of your language, Adam, maybe not directly, even your strategy you showed used the word commissioning, which tends to, and contracts, you said. So that was it, really. But thanks.
No, it's a good shout. It's a really difficult one because, again, I come from a private training background, so procuring a contract or winning a procured contract was something that I was more conscious of when I came to the council. And so when we were talking about how do we do this in a way that's different, we had a lot of discussion with procurement colleagues about how did we get the flexibility we needed, and we came up with it. We couldn't procure the contracts and get the flexibility we wanted. So yes, the contracts play a bad word. We use grant agreements and service level agreements for the actual vocabulary when we're talking to delivery partners. And we put out a challenge fund in terms of we ask for expressions of interest based on a commissioning framework or a challenge fund framework. Again, we've used both terminologies over the years, but the last two have been challenge fund frameworks. When the expressions of interest come in, we ask people to complete a template, which is essentially telling us what they'd like to do, and we score those templates, and we score those applications. It then goes from the scoring team to our Opportunities Fife team to pick preferred bidders. What I will say is that, I mean, we get bids in that says, give us £3 million and we'll do everything but sing and dance for you. And we tend to say, that's a great project. We will keep that project. They're a preferred bidder. But we go back to them and say, we'd probably like to scale that down a little bit. And we have a conversation about, you're not going to get £1 million, but for £100,000, what out of this activity could you deliver? Instead of us funding 70 members of staff, what would you do for 6 members of staff, and how would that work? And we create a service level agreement based on the budget that we have available. I see some of my delivery partners laughing behind the scenes here as I'm talking, but that's something that goes through from
no one ever put in that big application, surely.
Well, I don't know about that, but we have those conversations. So, and then when it comes to we grant fund, we send a grant letter, and there's a service level agreement that goes with that. So I do understand that in my head, the terms are interchangeable because we're commissioning services, but we're not procuring services. Because as I said, we're not buying X amount of jobs for X amount of pounds. We have delivery partners that that produce a content of delivery, and then we create a partnership basically that we try and negotiate what we can both get out of it.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Andy. Yeah, and I think I suspect that this procurement commissioning conversation is one that will rumble on around and around the houses, and maybe come up to some of the national discussions as well. But it's really it's good to keep exploring what's possible, I think, because clearly there are completely different approaches in every area. I wanted to come to Michelle. So Michelle had another question, was around the lived experience on scoring panels, how to include that in an efficient way. Now I see Kate's replied saying they do that at Capital City Partnership, and yeah, all I wanted to add to that was because we did it over a couple of iterations before I left Fife, and I guess that'll be happening again with the next round of commissioning coming up. But very similar to Capital City Partnership, we just were very clear on the time frame, so everybody was well prepped in advance. We did training for everybody on the panel, which included the lived experience participants as well as the other strategic partners. So everybody was on the same kind of understanding of what they were scoring, why they were scoring this way, and so on, and what to look out for. Yeah, we just timed everything. I think it probably extended the window between bids coming in and the assessment panel by maybe 4 days or so. I'm not sure, Adam, but it was something like that, just to give people a bit more time to read the applications. But we went from, when we first did it, we gave everybody all of the applications, and then we realized that was all a bit much, and so we tranched them up. So there was a kind of a team looking at 4 or 5 in this team, a team looking at 4 or 5 in that team, and that way.
I wanted to point that out, Pegs. Yeah, that there was a member of the lived experience panel that joined the overall scoring team, but they were representing the views of a panel of lived experience people that scored the bids as a team, essentially.
Yeah, that's an important distinction. Yeah, so that's how we worked it out, and that works for us and in our area. But I've put my email in the chat, and I'm super happy to talk to anybody who's interested in that. And it looks like Kate might be able to offer some good insight and experience as well. So sharing the learning. So I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. Is there anybody else who would like to ask a question of Adam or Andy while we've got them here? Feel free to wave an electronic hand or just unmute if you're having IT issues. I suppose maybe to end with, I did have one question which I thought is, and it comes back to Andy's point about the learning being the difficulty, and the sharing the hope, but also the challenges. Because if we aren't willing to talk about what's difficult about doing this work, then we're not really embracing the spirit of the activity. So I suppose to both of you, what would you say has been your key learning or the biggest challenge for you in taking forward these approaches in your different contexts, and maybe the biggest learning that you've taken from that? And I didn't tee you up with that, so I'm sorry.
That's cool. I'll have a go, which I think links to some of the discussion we've had and some of the comments as well in the chat box. But I think 2 elements combined. So for me, one is you're never starting from where you want to end up. And that's really difficult. This is a bit like Harriet's question around culture, that you have to start somewhere. The culture isn't exactly where you want it to be, so it feels like that's a barrier to you moving. So it's kind of just accepting that it's an imperfect world, and you just got to keep going and keep going and keep going. And I think the measure of success that I keep trying to remind myself of is it's where are we now relative to where we started, rather than are we there yet? Because I think in this work it can become self-defeating to actually have these big lofty end game ambitions when that's just not where you're at. So it's how much better today than yesterday is something I've learned you have to stay anchored to. And then I think linked to that, the other thing is there's always a there's always a thing of the moment, right? We've got to get this contract done, or we've got to, whatever it is. And the thing of the moment, I think, can make it really easy to slip into transactional type behaviors, when really what I think this work is about creating the sort of environment and the ecosystem for enduring relationships that are going to kind of take you forward day by day by day by day. And so, when I look at some of the questions in the chat box, and there's issues around short-term funding and these sorts of things, and I think my gut reaction to that is, having worked across a number of different geographies now, it's very often, in fact, it's typically the case that the same faces are in the mix over decades, but they might be in different roles in different organizations and so on. And so it's how are you creating this community of people around a purpose, rather than how we're getting locked into these transactional experiences of I'm buying a contract from this provider this week and then buying something else from someone else next week. So I think for me, that's it. It's that sense of keeping the relational and the purpose at the center, holding the lofty ambitions, but using the measure of success as where am I today relative to yesterday, rather than being defeated by the fact that it's a big job.
Thanks, Andy. And Adam, you've been given a little bit of grace, because I've realised an additional question has come in from Andy in the chat, and also I missed one from David, so my apologies, David, which was around that short-term funding. So there was the question around, how can we ensure that this approach isn't hindered? And obviously it hasn't been in Fife, but I know that in other areas that is really difficult, but the late, short, reduced funding issue. So there was that question, and then it might be one that you want to reply to Andy about separately, probably, but possibly, but around the challenge fund and whether that's open to the private sector as well. So just pick up those before you come to your final reflection.
We had the challenge fund open to everyone. The last couple of years, we've only once had the private provider come in with a bid, but we've actually got a private provider on the part or the pathway at this time for the first time. So that was a different one for us, because their grant fund's slightly different to other ones, but that's they were one of the preferred bidders with one of their projects. What was the other question? Sorry,
it was about
I can't see
the funding and how that might hinder the ability to work in this way, basically the sort of, the late announcements, the short.
Oh God, it's horrendous. It's horrendous. It's horrendous. We do a lot of work to try and to do projections. Again, I can see Zoe laughing because she's like, "Where's my money for next year?" But it's like you have to have an understanding of what you're trying to deliver. And I mean, I'm going to my group in October. Dorothy, my chair, is here, and we've been talking about this just now, that we have to have funding scenarios prepared for what if UK SPF disappears, what if No One Left Behind disappears, what if they're slashed and burned by 50%, what if they're both burned by 50%, when do we wind down activity? Which means that we're going to have to tell everyone before Christmas that there's no money after April, and we're having those discussions now. It's horrible. We would love to be in a position where Scottish Government tell us in January what our budget's going to be in April, so that we can have those discussions in the last quarter and we can run things through. The last couple of years we've commissioned, or the last couple of times we've commissioned activity based on a projected or expected grant from UK and Scottish Government, and then tried to make the numbers work eventually. Luckily, what we've tried to do is commission at a scalable level. So we talk about people putting in allocations or options at a certain level, which we think we can afford, and it allows us to then upscale or build on it where there's need. Other time, I mean, I don't think we've had to cut people in terms of we've asked you to do X, but actually the funding's through, so we've only got enough for Y. So I don't think we've ever been that unfortunate yet. But no, it's a complete nightmare. You would really like to be in the position to say, here's ideally 5 years worth of funding. You're going to get this per year for the next 5 years. I mean, even 3 years would be a help to give any continuity. But no, it's hugely difficult.
Thanks, Adam. I think those are both really helpful responses. Andy, I see a bit of chat from John as well. So I think there might be some useful conversations offline around some of the procurement commissioning conversations that we can pick up. And just because Michelle has no mic, I'll just, on her behalf, a couple of observations. So she says, I think this approach would really help with the value for money issue, because it sometimes feels like cheap is what's being looked for, where often mostly quality is not the cheapest option. And also this should support the move from solely hard outcomes, as was said. So, you know, a lot of us are working with people who they're finding referrals needing longer term support. So soft outcomes and recognizing distance traveled is really helpful when reviewing performance. Wendy's also said some nice words, being really encouraged by today, been around the sector through delivery latterly strategic for 3 decades, actually hopeful for the long term. However, I think we're going to keep holding on to that hope. Yes, I agree, Wendy. I'm absolutely all for holding on to the hope. Keep the faith over the coming months. In fact, you know, this is the rounding chorus at the end. Keep the faith over the coming few months and years, and focus on the next step in front of us and the small wins. I think that's a really lovely comment and capture of, I think, some of what I feel can come from working in these different ways, and what I think No One Left Behind has potential to offer for how we do employability in Scotland, and create an ecosystem, if you like, that is right for each area as well as the country as a whole. So I'm just going to end by thanking both Adam and Andy so much for giving up their time and experience this afternoon. I hope people have found it useful and informative. I have, and I was involved, so that's a win. We will, Jane, with the support of Jane and Social Enterprise Scotland, thank you to them for hosting this session, for recording it, because I don't have the capacity to do that. We couldn't do that without them. So a recording will be sent out. Please feel free to share it with anyone and everyone you think might find it useful and interesting. And there will be an evaluation that will come out as well. And again, your feedback on this session, but also ideas around forthcoming sessions, much appreciated. A couple of trails. I have got one date, but there will be sessions looking at commissioning with communities coming up. What else have I got? System stewardship. It's quite an interesting thing, which is kind of like, you know, how can we take a system stewardship approach, building on all of this work. And I'm also thinking about looking at alliance contracting as well, which I think will be particularly relevant to some of the areas like the islands and so on, where really, you know, the kind of traditional model may be less relevant. So thank you again for your time. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to Jane for our hosts, and yeah, look forward to staying in touch. I think you gain 8 minutes of your day.
Thanks, Pegs. Thanks, everyone.